Hello, this is Mr. Cox with supercharged and intercooled science and animal videos. Today I'm going to cover a subject that I often cover both in 7th and 8th grade science, but is also very important for the beginning classes in biology, when we're talking about the characteristics of life. The characteristics of life, here to just summarize it, then we'll go back through each one. All life is organized into cells with genetic material. That genetic material will be either RNA, ribonucleic acid, which is one-stranded, or DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, which is double-stranded. All life responds to stimuli in the environment. All life grows and develops, at least in some part of its life. All life reproduces. There are asexual and sexual types of reproduction. The next one is all life uses and transfers energy. That's called metabolism. This falls into two categories, the autotrophs and the heterotrophs. The next one is homeostasis. All life has the ability to maintain internal conditions. Number 7, life comes from life. There is no spontaneous generation. Lastly, and then like I said, we'll go through each slide, but lastly on the summary, all life is made out of the chemicals of life, which would include things like water and macromolecules that are carbon-based, such as carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. Next slide. Let's look a little more closely at each one of these. All life contains genetic material. So here we see deoxyribonucleic acid. It's a double-stranded helix. Here you can see part of it has been separating to copy that part of the DNA, but it's a double helix strand. The other is ribonucleic acid, which is a single strand of helix. Ribonucleic acid is important in many functions of the cells of all type of life, but for most animal types of life and most plant types of life, you find that DNA is the main genetic carrier of our genetic material. So there are some viruses. Again, I don't want to go too far into this right now, but there is a question among scientists and virologists and microbiologists on whether or not viruses are actually alive, because they just seem to be either a protein sheath with some either DNA or RNA in it, or some don't have a protein sheath and it's just DNA or RNA, and they don't do anything until they're picked up by a living organism, a non-viral living organism. Then the coding in the DNA or RNA of the virus takes over part of the process in the living cells or living organism to make more copies of itself. Next one. Life responds to stimuli in the environment. If you take a rock and it's laying there and the sun shines bright and it's 100 degrees outside, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and I know we usually use Celsius or centigrade in science, but it's very hot outside. The rock doesn't get up and move into the shade because it's getting too hot. Likewise, if it's very cold, the rock doesn't crawl out of the shade to go find the sunlight to get warm. However, if you take a living thing, if you just think about a snake or a lizard, when they eat something, they need to be able to warm up in order to metabolize and digest that and metabolize the food that they've eaten. So they'll crawl up on a warm rock in the sunlight to metabolize that food, to get it digested and put into their system. But even plants, they respond to sunlight. It doesn't happen real quick where you can watch them, but if you have a plant, just think if you have a potted plant in your windowsill, you'll find that most of the leaves and the flowers will turn towards the window. And if you turn the plant around, so they're then turning away from it, and you leave it in the window another day, you go back the next day, and you'll find that many of them have turned towards the sunlight. So they do respond. They respond to things like light, sound, gravity, touch, and temperature, things in the environment. Living things respond to stimuli in the environment. The next thing is all life grows and develops. Now, when I said there's a point in a person's life, in a human's life, or in an animal's life, or even a plant's life, when it becomes very old, and it's not growing and developing anymore. However, it has grown and developed from the time it was first a fertilized egg. It starts making copies of itself, copying its DNA, and making more and more cells, and becoming a zygote, and becoming an embryo, and then it grows up. And if it's hatched out, it's a creature that's hatched out of an egg, then it will develop that way. If it's a creature that where live birth is the process, then you have a baby, or a baby animal, or a baby human born, and then that baby will continue to grow. Notice also with plants, you plant a seed which contains the DNA of that plant, as well as material in it to provide food for it for the first part of its life, until it can start taking that out of the ground. And the seed sprouts, becomes a small plant, becomes a larger plant, and it continues to grow until it gets its maximum size, and before it stops developing. Next one. Life reproduces. There are two main categories of reproduction. Now, when I'm talking about this, I'm not talking about gender choices. That's a whole different thing. I'm just talking about the biology. So we won't go there with the other. I know there's, all different ways of looking at different things, but I'm just talking about biological reproduction. So asexual reproduction is when the mother can give birth to babies or young offspring without a male. Now, this does not occur in any mammals that I'm aware of, and it certainly doesn't occur in the higher mammals, such as humans. It usually only occurs in things like certain types of amphibians and a few types of snakes. And what happens is, and some microbes. So what happens is, if there are no males present in the population, or not enough males, the female has the ability to reproduce itself, and it clones itself, basically. It makes all the daughters are exactly the same as the mother. However, when males are present, then you get variability, because you get a mixing of male and female genetic material, and so you get all the different eye colors, all the different hair colors, all the different traits. And so pros and cons of both. With asexual reproduction, it is a means for a species to survive if there's drought conditions, or not enough males, or something like that. And with, however, you don't get the variability. With sexual reproduction, you get variability. So if everything is all exactly alike, all has the same DNA, and the same phenotype, the way it looks, everything to do with it. If there's, let's say, a certain type of plague comes by, a certain types of infection, it can wipe out all of that species if you don't have genetic variability. When you have sexual reproduction, then you have genetic variability, so that plague or that disease may kill off a large percentage of the population, but the percentage of the population that can resist it survives, and it passes that trait on to the next generation. Sorry about my voice being a little rough. Been having a little bit of allergy problems lately. Next one is metabolism. All life uses energy. These the two types are autotrophs and heterotrophs. The easiest way to look at this is autotrophs don't have to eat something else or consume something else to get their energy. This would be things like plants that undergo photosynthesis using the sun's light to produce energy. They're typically producing glucose, which can form into other chains of glucoses put together, other things like fructose and carbohydrates, etc. But it's producing that itself. Heterotrophs are anything that eats other creatures or other plants or anything else or consumes it in order to get energy. Next slide. Homeostasis. All life has the ability to maintain its internal situation. So it varies with creatures. So warm-blooded creatures can maintain their body temperature. Cold-blooded creatures cannot. So then you get them going into hibernation when it gets very cold, or they estivate, which is similar to hibernation. They become inactive when they get too cold. Or you get the warm-blooded creatures that can control their body temperature. But down at the cellular level, it's as simple as things. When I say simple, it's not really simple. It's a very complex system, but it's more simple than maintaining your heat throughout your body. So cells they have a cell membrane on the outside of them. They have to be able to use that cell membrane to determine what comes into the cell and what leaves the cell. That way they can maintain the right amount of liquid and nutrients inside of them, and things like salt, metabolites. They can get waste and poisons and put them outside of the cell membrane to get rid of them. Or if they get too much salt, they can pump the salt out. If they don't have enough salt or enough water, they can take water in. So that's homeostasis. Next slide. All life comes from life. No spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation would mean that life just popped out on its own from non-living material. That's called abiogenesis. All life coming from life is biogenesis, which is what we see. So a couple of examples I put here. They used to, hundreds of years ago, scientists and like Aristotle and philosophers and others, they really genuinely thought that if you left a bunch of garbage in a room or outside in the alley, probably faster out inside the alley, it would turn into rats. Because they would notice that as garbage piles up in the alleys, that rats start showing up. And they didn't realize that rats were just being attracted to the garbage. And they thought if you left meat out and it wasn't properly preserved, it could just turn into maggots. What happened here with Francesco Redi, he did an experiment where he took jars and he put meat in them. Some of the jars he left open. Some of the jars he put something like a screen over the top of it, a fine screen, a cheesecloth, and he observed. He watched flies come and set on the jars that had the cheesecloth. They couldn't get through, and even after many days, no maggots came out of the meat in the covered jar. But he watched in the other jar, flies would come and they would set on the meat, lay eggs, and then after a few days, they would hatch out into maggots. And so he determined that no, spontaneous generation is not occurring. It's flies laying eggs, which hatch out into maggots. And likewise, Louis Pasteur later also did another experiment, which he put beef broth into some different flasks. He heated the flasks, the glass flasks, and then he pinched off some of them and sealed the neck. On others, he broke the neck, and he had the neck where it was bent down, where it was open but it was bent down. Others, he busted the neck clear off so it was open on the top. And what he found is the boiled broth, after so many days, continued to look and smell fine. You'd have to open it to find out how it smelled. But nothing was wrong with it. It was still the same color as broth. But the ones that had the opening, especially the ones that had the popped off top, where anything could just fall into it, they would start turning really nasty colors, and some really foul odors would start coming off them as gas was emitted. This was to later help give rise to the germ theory, because it was determined that things were falling out of the atmosphere that the scientists couldn't yet see. They were landing in the beef broth of the open one. And as the microscopic creatures reproduced and fed on the beef broth, it became rancid. It became nasty. Last slide. All life is made up of the building blocks of life. They're made up of water, H2O, and carbon-based chemicals, which often form macromolecules. So where it says monomers there, that's like the smallest building block of that chain of building blocks called a macromolecule. We'll cover this more when we talk just about macromolecules. But there's 4 types. One's carbohydrates. These are made up of simple sugars like glucose. Glucose is the monomer. As you put more glucoses together, you get fructose, you get sucrose, you get different types of sugars. And then long chains of it become things like carbohydrates, starches, or become starches, they are carbohydrates. The next one would be proteins. The building blocks of proteins are amino acids. Any of you that are bodybuilders are probably familiar with the importance of amino acids. We all need amino acids, and all living things do, in order to live. And chains of these amino acids make up different types of proteins, which carry out all kinds of functions in our bodies. The next one is nucleic acids. This is basically your genetic material, RNA or DNA. Nucleotides are the monomer, or the small building blocks of it. When these form into long chains of them, you make, or I should say, it happens in nature that nucleic acids are made. The other one is lipids. These are things like fats, oils, waxes. The monomer for this, the 2 monomers are glycerols and fatty acids. When glycerols and fatty acids form chains, they make lipids. I'm going to stop here for this slideshow. I'm using some of my other slideshows I put together. It's taking some time because I'm going back and making sure that I don't have any copyrighted material from someone else in them that I just clipped and pasted offline. I don't want to do that. And so for some of them, I'm drawing my own images, and otherwise I'm making sure that I'm using non-copyrighted material that's public domain or free to use. So I have a whole different groups of slides that I'm going to do this with. This is my first of this series. I thought it would be helpful to some of my past students who are in either 7th or 8th grade science, and those in biology, which should be looking at this at the beginning of the class. See you in another video. Thank you. I don't want that. Hello, this is Mr. Cox with a Supercharged and Integral Science. I want to talk about the electromagnetic spectrum today, so I'm going to go back here to one of my favorite apps, a free app called Blackboard. No, I don't want that. If I did the whole thing,